Have you ever wondered why the person who seems least interested in you becomes the most intoxicating? Why the one who pulls away triggers something so deep, so primal, that you'd rather chase shadows than hold certainty? There's a psychological phenomenon that Carl Jung identified decades ago, hidden in the depths of human attachment patterns, that explains why some people become absolutely magnetic when they withhold their presence. It's not about playing hard to get, it's about tapping into something far more ancient and powerful. The avoidant personality doesn't just resist connection. They create a specific type of psychological vacuum that triggers what Jung called the anima or animus projection. When someone consistently maintains distance, they become a blank canvas for our deepest fantasies about love, connection, and completion. But here's what terrifies most people. The avoidant isn't withholding randomly. They're unconsciously creating the exact conditions that make certain people obsess over them. It's as if they instinctively know that the human psyche is wired to want what it cannot have, to chase what retreats, to value what remains mysterious. If you've ever found yourself completely consumed by someone who seemed just out of reach, hit that subscribe button because we're about to reveal psychological patterns that most people never recognize in themselves. Think about it. The person who texts back immediately, who's always available, who shows their full hand, they rarely create the kind of magnetic pull that keeps someone awake at night. But the one who responds hours later, who maintains their independence, who never quite lets you see their full emotional landscape, they become the subject of endless mental movies. This isn't about manipulation tactics or dating strategies. This is about understanding a fundamental pattern of human psychology that Jung recognized as one of the most powerful forces in human relationships. The avoidant doesn't just avoid attachment, they accidentally create the perfect conditions for others to become deeply attached to them. And if you're someone who finds yourself always chasing the unavailable, or if you're someone who naturally maintains distance and notices others becoming mysteriously drawn to you, what we're about to explore will change how you understand every relationship you've ever had. If you've ever been completely captivated by someone who seemed to slip through your fingers like water, give this video a like because you're about to understand why. You're not imagining the intensity of your attraction to unavailable people. Your instincts are picking up on something real, something that goes deeper than surface-level chemistry or compatibility. What you're experiencing is your psyche's response to what Jung called the transcendent function, the part of your unconscious mind that's always seeking completion, always trying to integrate the parts of yourself that you've rejected or never fully developed. When you encounter someone who maintains emotional distance, your unconscious mind doesn't just see a person who's unavailable. It sees a mirror of your own unlived potential, your own capacity for independence, mystery, and self-containment. The avoidant becomes a living representation of the parts of yourself that you've either suppressed or never fully explored. Here's what no one tells you. The intensity you feel isn't really about them. It's about recognizing something in them that your soul knows it needs to develop within itself. The avoidant person becomes a projection screen for your own journey toward wholeness. This is why the attraction feels so different from normal romantic interest. It's not just about wanting them, it's about wanting to become something through them. They represent a doorway to a version of yourself that you've never fully embodied. More independent, more mysterious, more complete within yourself. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been drawn to someone specifically because they seem to need nothing from you? What country are you watching from? The community here understands these deep patterns. But here's where it gets psychologically complex. The avoidant person isn't consciously creating this dynamic. They're simply being themselves, protecting their autonomy, maintaining their independence, processing emotions internally. What they don't realize is that these natural behaviors trigger something archetypal in certain people. The person who becomes obsessed with the avoidant isn't weak or needy. They're actually responding to a deep psychological invitation to develop the very qualities that the avoidant embodies. Your attraction is your unconscious mind's way of saying, pay attention to this. There's something here you need to integrate. This is why traditional dating advice fails so spectacularly with avoidant dynamics. You can't logic your way out of an archetypal pattern. You can't strategize your way past a call from your unconscious to grow into a more complete version of yourself. Haven't you noticed that the people who don't affect you this way are often the ones who are immediately available, who wear their hearts on their sleeves, who need you as much as you might need them? They don't trigger the same deep psychological response because they don't represent the unlived aspects of your personality. Carl Jung discovered that human beings don't just love people, they love what those people represent in their unconscious minds. He called this projection, and it's one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. When someone exhibits avoidant behaviors, maintaining independence, processing emotions privately, not becoming easily attached, they accidentally activate what Jung identified as the anima or animus complex in others. This isn't just psychological theory, it's a pattern that plays out in relationships across all cultures and time periods. The anima in Jung's framework represents the unconscious feminine aspect within men, while the animus represents the unconscious masculine aspect within women. But more broadly, these concepts point to the parts of ourselves that we haven't fully integrated, the qualities, strengths, and ways of being that we admire in others because we haven't fully developed them in ourselves. Here's what makes avoidant people so psychologically compelling. They naturally embody self-containment, emotional regulation, and independence. For people who struggle with these qualities, the avoidant becomes a living representation of what they unconsciously know they need to develop within themselves. Research in attachment theory, building on Jung's insights, shows that roughly 25% of the population has an avoidant attachment style. These individuals learned early that emotional self-reliance was safer than depending on others. They developed the ability to meet their own emotional needs, to process feelings internally, and to maintain their sense of self even in intimate relationships. But here's the paradox. The very qualities that make them seem unavailable are often the qualities that make them most attractive to people with anxious attachment styles. The anxious person, who may struggle with self-soothing and emotional regulation, unconsciously recognizes that the avoidant person possesses exactly what they need to develop within themselves. If you're starting to recognize these patterns in your own relationships, pause this video and think about one person who affected you this way. What specific qualities did they have that you wished you could develop in yourself? This creates what Jung called a compensatory relationship, where each person represents what the other lacks. The anxious person represents emotional openness and vulnerability, while the avoidant person represents emotional self-sufficiency and independence. Neither is complete without integrating the other's strengths. But here's where most people get stuck. They try to get these qualities from the other person instead of developing them within themselves. The person obsessed with the avoidance spends their energy trying to capture and possess the avoidance independence, rather than cultivating their own. The avoidant, meanwhile, often finds themselves unconsciously attracted to people who can express emotions freely, who can be vulnerable, who can connect easily, because these represent their own undeveloped capacities. This isn't about fixing or changing anyone. It's about recognizing that intense attraction often points to our own psychological growth edges. The person who captivates you isn't just someone you want to be with, there's someone showing you who you need to become. The avoidance power lies not in what they reveal, but in what they conceal. When someone maintains emotional distance, they create what psychologists call ambiguous stimuli, situations where your brain has to fill in the gaps. Your unconscious mind doesn't interpret this ambiguity as disinterest. Instead, it sees infinite possibility. The avoidant becomes a blank canvas onto which you project your deepest fantasies about love, connection, and emotional fulfillment. This is why the avoidant's silence feels more compelling than someone else's words. In that silence, your mind constructs elaborate narratives about their inner world, their feelings, their potential love for you. You become the author of a relationship that exists primarily in your imagination, and stories we create ourselves are always more captivating than stories told to us. People like us understand that the most intense relationships often happen in the spaces between words, in the gaps between interactions. Share this with someone who gets it. Jung observed that when we can't clearly see someone's emotional landscape, we unconsciously project our own anima or animus onto them. The avoidant person becomes a container for all your unlived romantic fantasies, your idealized vision of love, your dreams of the perfect partner. But here's what's psychologically fascinating. The avoidant often has no idea this is happening. They're not strategically withholding to create mystery, they're simply being themselves. Their natural way of processing emotions internally, of maintaining independence, of not becoming immediately attached, accidentally creates the perfect conditions for others to become deeply attached to them. This is why the fantasy often feels more real than reality. When you're with the avoidant, you're not just interacting with a person, you're interacting with your own projections, your own hopes, your own vision of what love could be. The actual person becomes secondary to the psychological drama playing out in your unconscious mind. The avoidant's occasional moments of warmth or connection become magnified in your memory because they're rare. Intermittent reinforcement, getting positive responses unpredictably, is one of the most powerful psychological conditioning mechanisms known to science. The avoidant inadvertently creates the exact reward schedule that makes their attention incredibly valuable. Think about it. If someone is warm and available 100% of the time, you adapt to that baseline. But if someone is warm and available only 20% of the time, those moments become precious, memorable, significant. Your brain interprets the rarity as value. This explains why a simple text from an avoidant person can make someone's entire day, while the same text from an anxiously attached person might barely register. It's not about the content of the message, it's about the psychological context of scarcity and unpredictability. Your sensitivity to these patterns isn't weakness, it's your unconscious mind recognizing archetypal patterns that most people never notice. Honor that depth. The avoidance fantasy creating power also lies in their emotional self-regulation. Because they don't immediately react emotionally because they can sit with feelings without expressing them, they seem to possess a kind of emotional mastery that others find deeply attractive. In a world where many people are emotionally reactive, someone who can remain calm, who can process their feelings internally, who doesn't need external validation, appears to have achieved something that others unconsciously know they need to develop. But here's the crucial insight. The fantasy isn't really about the avoidant person at all. It's about your own journey toward emotional self-sufficiency, your own development of inner stability, your own capacity to be complete within yourself while still being open to connection. The avoidant becomes a mirror showing you the parts of yourself that you need to integrate to become whole. Here's what Carl Jung understood that most people miss. The avoidant person isn't trying to be attractive through distance. They're simply living according to their own psychological reality, which happens to trigger something archetypal in others. The avoidant learned early, usually in childhood, that emotional self-reliance was safer than depending on others for regulation, comfort, or validation. They developed what Jung would call a compensatory attitude, an unconscious strategy to balance the vulnerabilities they experienced in early attachment relationships. This compensation created genuine strengths, the ability to self-soothe, to process emotions internally, to maintain their sense of self even in intimate relationships, to find meaning and fulfillment from within rather than seeking it externally. These aren't masks or strategies, they're authentic psychological developments. But here's where it gets psychologically complex. These strengths often developed as protection against the very intimacy that others crave with them. The avoidant person learned to meet their own emotional needs because depending on others felt too dangerous, too unpredictable, too threatening to their sense of self. Has this happened to you? Have you ever been completely drawn to someone who seemed to need nothing from you, only to discover that their independence was actually a form of self-protection? When you're intensely attracted to an avoidant person, you're not just attracted to their independence, you're attracted to their apparent mastery over the very needs that might drive you toward them. They seem to have solved the problem of emotional dependency, and your unconscious mind recognizes this as something you need to develop within yourself. This creates what Jung called a compensatory relationship dynamic. The person drawn to the avoidant represents emotional openness, vulnerability, and the capacity for intimate connection. The avoidant represents emotional self-sufficiency, independence, and the capacity for solitude. Each carries what the other needs to develop for psychological wholeness. But here's the trap. Most people try to get these qualities from the relationship rather than developing them within themselves. The anxiously attached person spends their energy trying to capture the avoidant's independence, rather than cultivating their own emotional self-sufficiency. Meanwhile, the avoidant often finds themselves unconsciously attracted to people who can express emotions freely, who can be vulnerable, who can connect easily, because these represent their own undeveloped capacities for emotional expression and intimate connection. What if everything you believe about playing hard to get is actually missing the deeper psychological truth? What if the attraction isn't about games at all, but about recognizing unlived parts of yourself? The truth is that the avoidance fantasies aren't fantasies at all, they're psychological realities. They genuinely do value independence, emotional self-regulation, and the capacity to be fulfilled within themselves. They're not pretending to be self-sufficient. They actually develop these capacities as adaptive responses to their early experiences. This is why traditional relationship advice fails so spectacularly with avoidant dynamics. You can't convince someone to be more emotionally available when their entire psychological structure is built around emotional self-reliance. You can't argue someone out of an adaptation that has kept them psychologically safe. But here's what's possible. You can recognize that your attraction to them is pointing toward your own psychological growth. Instead of trying to change them, you can develop within yourself the qualities that you find so attractive in them. This doesn't mean becoming avoidant yourself. It means integrating the healthy aspects of emotional self-sufficiency while maintaining your capacity for connection and vulnerability. It means learning to be complete within yourself while still being open to intimate relationships. Jung called this process individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness that involves integrating the rejected or undeveloped aspects of our personality. Your intense attraction to the avoidant person is actually your unconscious mind's way of pointing toward the next stage of your own psychological development. When you begin to develop your own emotional self-sufficiency, something miraculous happens. You become less needy of others' emotional availability and more attractive to the very people who once seemed unreachable. The avoidant person becomes a teacher, showing you what it looks like to be psychologically complete within yourself. The lesson isn't about becoming emotionally distant. It's about becoming emotionally sovereign while remaining open to genuine connection. The path forward isn't about learning to manipulate avoidant people or becoming avoidant yourself. It's about recognizing that your intense attraction to them is pointing toward your own psychological development. Specifically, your need to integrate the healthy aspects of emotional independence while maintaining your capacity for connection. Jung's concept of individuation suggests that we're naturally drawn to people who embody the qualities we need to develop within ourselves. Your attraction to the avoidant person is actually your unconscious mind's way of saying, pay attention to this. There's something here you need to integrate. Right now, think about one quality that you find most attractive in avoidant people. Is it their independence? Their emotional self-regulation? Their ability to be content alone? That's your growth edge. The integration process begins with understanding that you don't need to capture these qualities from someone else. You need to develop them within yourself. This means learning to self-soothe when you're anxious, to find fulfillment from within rather than seeking it externally, to maintain your sense of self even when someone else is emotionally unavailable. But here's what's crucial. Integrating these qualities doesn't mean suppressing your natural capacity for emotional openness and vulnerability. It means becoming someone who can be both independent and connected, both self-sufficient and open to intimacy. When you develop genuine emotional self-sufficiency, something paradoxical happens. You become less needy of others' emotional availability, which often makes you more attractive to the very people who once seemed unreachable. But more importantly, you become less compulsively attracted to people simply because they're unavailable. As you integrate these qualities, you'll notice that your relationships become more balanced. You'll stop chasing people who can't meet you emotionally, and you'll start attracting people who can match your level of emotional maturity. The healthy integration involves developing what Jung called psychological containment, the ability to hold your own emotions without needing immediate external validation or soothing. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally distant. It means becoming emotionally sovereign. You learn to sit with anxiety without immediately seeking reassurance. You develop the capacity to process disappointment without immediately blaming or pursuing. You cultivate the ability to find meaning and fulfillment from within while remaining open to sharing that fulfillment with others. This integration transforms your entire approach to relationships. Instead of seeking someone to complete you, you begin seeking someone to share your completeness with. Instead of being attracted to people because they seem to have what you lack, you're attracted to people because of the genuine compatibility and mutual growth you can create together. You begin to reclaim the parts of yourself that you've been projecting onto others. Your power comes from within rather than from trying to capture it from someone else. The avoidant person in this context becomes a teacher rather than a target. They show you what emotional self-sufficiency looks like, what it means to be complete within yourself, what it feels like to not need external validation for your worth. But the full integration also involves developing what the avoidant person often lacks: the ability to be emotionally vulnerable, to share your inner world, to create genuine intimacy. You don't become avoidant yourself. You become someone who can embody both independence and connection. Start practicing emotional self-sufficiency in small ways. When you feel anxious, try sitting with the feeling for 5 minutes before seeking reassurance. When you feel lonely, try connecting with yourself before reaching out to others. This is how you transform the compulsive attraction into conscious choice. You stop being unconsciously drawn to people who can't meet you emotionally because you've learned to meet yourself emotionally. You stop projecting your unlived potentials onto others because you've begun living them yourself. The relationship with the avoidant person, whether it continues or not, becomes a catalyst for your own psychological growth rather than a source of endless frustration and longing. The most profound relationships in your life aren't the ones that give you what you want, they're the ones that show you who you need to become. The avoidant person in your life isn't a problem to be solved or a prize to be won. They're a mirror reflecting the parts of yourself that you need to integrate to become psychologically whole. Carl Jung understood that we don't just love people, we love what they represent in our unconscious minds. Your intense attraction to someone who maintains emotional distance isn't about them at all. It's about your own journey toward emotional sovereignty, your own development of inner stability, your own capacity to be complete within yourself while still being open to genuine connection. From now on, when you feel that familiar pull towards someone who seems unavailable, ask yourself, what quality do they have that I need to develop within myself? This reframes the entire experience from pursuit to self-development. The avoidant person's power lies not in their unavailability, but in their unconscious demonstration of emotional self-sufficiency. They show you what it looks like to be psychologically complete within yourself, to find meaning and fulfillment from within, to maintain your sense of self even in intimate relationships. But the full integration requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox, to be both independent and connected, both self-sufficient and open to intimacy. You don't become avoidant yourself. You become someone who can embody both strength and vulnerability, both solitude and connection. You begin to see yourself not as someone who needs to capture love from others, but as someone who has love to share. This changes everything about how you approach relationships. When you develop genuine emotional self-sufficiency, you stop being compulsively attracted to people simply because they're unavailable. You start being attracted to people because of the genuine compatibility and mutual growth you can create together. You stop seeking someone to complete you and start seeking someone to share your completeness with. The avoidant person becomes a teacher in your journey towards psychological wholeness. They show you what aspects of yourself you need to integrate, what parts of your personality you need to develop, what qualities you need to embody to become truly attractive, not just to them but to yourself. This isn't just about modern dating or relationship strategies. This is about archetypal patterns that have played out in human relationships for thousands of years. You're connecting with something timeless about the human journey toward wholeness. Your sensitivity to these patterns isn't weakness, it's your unconscious mind recognizing opportunities for growth that most people miss. Honor that depth. Use it as fuel for your own psychological development. The next time you feel that familiar pull towards someone who seems to slip through your fingers like water, remember, they're not rejecting you. They're showing you who you need to become. This is just the beginning of understanding how archetypal patterns play out in modern relationships. The next video reveals how to recognize when someone is unconsciously mirroring your own unlived potentials. And it changes everything about how you understand attraction. You won't want to miss it.